Good evening, Ma'am Cornelia. Good evening, classmates. I am Mikaela S. Magaya. Along with Jessa S. Mohillo, we are going to tackle Module 8, Neo-behaviorism, Tolman, and Bandura. So as you can see, there are two mazes, maze A and B. If you are going to solve the maze and look for the exit, you will notice or find out that maze B is a lot easier. This is because the two mazes were identical except that the entrance and exit points were reversed. So your experience in doing maze A helped answer maze B a lot easier. So why? This is because you have created mental maps of the things you perceive. So mental maps, or when we say mental maps, this refers to a map of information in the human mind and is used for navigating, creating or organizing information, creating meaning, and is used every day by common people, most often without the simplest realization of doing so. So based on the definition, we have behavioristic and cognitive perspective, meaning when the individual begin to respond to any stimulus, it will develop behavior. And when that behavior is always changed or always repeated, it will now become driven internally, and of course, there is a cognitive aspect of the repeated behavior that is done by the stimulus. This is what neo-behaviorism is about. It has aspects of behaviorism, but it also reaches out to the cognitive perspective. Now, in the neo-behaviorism theory, there are two famous theorists that proposed and studied about neo-behaviorism. We have Tolman, and the other one is Bandura. In Tolman's, it is called purposive behaviorism, and in Bandura, it is called social learning theory. In Tolman's, there are four terms that we have to remember or we have to understand. We have goal directedness, cognitive maps, latent learning, and intervening variables. In Bandura's, we will find that it's about principles, modeling, and the four conditions for effective modeling. Now let me introduce to you who is Edward Tolman. Edward Chase Tolman is an American psychologist and he is known for behavioral psychology. He was a he was a professor of psychology at University of California and was born on April 14, 1886 at Massachusetts, United States and died in 1959. So one of his contributions, not only in psychology, but of course being used in education, is the so-called purposive behaviorism, or also been referred to as sign language learning theory. Edward Chase Tolman introduced his purposive behaviorism in the early 1920s. Purposive behaviorism combines the study of behavior while also considering the purpose or goal of behavior. Tolman thought that learning developed from knowledge about the environment and how the organism relates to its environment. His theories on learning went against the traditionally accepted stimulus-response connections or the classical conditioning at his time that has been proposed by other psychologists such as Edward Thorndike. The sign language learning theory is more of the SS theory or stimulus to stimulus rather than the stimulus response theory. His theory was founded on two psychological views: the Gestalt psychologist and those of John B. Watson, the behaviorist. Gestalt psychologist is guided by the principle of holism, that is, a school of thought that looks at the human mind and behavior as a whole. Tolman disagreed with John B. Watson's behaviorism, so he initiated his own behaviorism, which became known as purposive behaviorism. The stimuli which are allowed in are not connected by just simple one-to-one switches to the outgoing responses. Rather, the incoming impulses are usually worked over and elaborated in the central control room into a tentative cognitive-like map of the environment. And it is this tentative map indicating routes and paths and environmental relationships which finally determines what responses, if any, the individual or organism will make or will finally make. A new stimulus or the sign becomes associated with already meaningful stimuli or the significant through a series of pairings. There was no need for reinforcement in order to establish learning or was what is called latent learning. Now let's move forward to Tolman's key concepts. Number one, learning is always purposive and goal directed. Tolman believes that there is always a purpose to what every human does, and the behavior of every organism depends on the purpose or depends on their goal. Cognitive maps. A cognitive map is a mental representation of the layout of one's environment. It seems that many animals, not just humans, are able to form a mental representation of an environment that they have been in or are currently in. So for example, when going to school every day, you are able to create an image in your mind of the roads along the way to the school from your starting point. So this representation is called a cognitive map. So Tolman also used cognitive maps or discovered cognitive maps in his experiments with rats. Have you ever learned something without realizing that you've learned it? That's called latent learning, which refers to the process in which learning takes place subconsciously without rewards or reinforcement. Latent learning can be done in many ways. Let's say you observe your parents time and time again as they tended to their garden. You've never given this task, but years later find yourself joining a community garden. You pick up your gloves and start gardening like your parents did. This is an example of both observational learning and latent learning. You observe someone else's actions and retain the information even though you were never asked to display your knowledge of working in a garden. Remember, latent learning is all done subconsciously. This means that you don't know what you're capable of. You may already have the skills and knowledge to complete tasks and accomplish things even if you have never done them before. Then we also have another key concept according to Tolman, intervening variable. These are variables that are not readily seen but serves as determinants of behavior. Example, in Tolman's experiments with the rats, he found out that hunger was an intervening variable. Hunger is a hypothetical internal state which has been used to explain the relationships between independent variables such as length of time without food or amount of food consumed and dependent variables which are measures of eating. Reinforcement not essential for learning. Tolman concluded that reinforcement is not essential for learning, although it provides an incentive for performance. In his studies, he observed that a rat was able to acquire knowledge of the way through a maze, that is, to develop a cognitive map, even the absence of the reinforcement.
Social learning theory. His social learning theory emphasizes the importance of observing, modeling, and imitating the behaviors attitudes, and emotional reactions of others. This theory considers how both environmental and cognitive factors interact to influence human learning and behavior. Albert Bandura was born on December 4, 1925 and was died on July 26, 2021. He is a Canadian-American psychologist. During his lifetime, he was widely described as the greatest living psychologist and is one of the most influential psychologists of all time. Bandura asserts that most human behavior is learned through observation, imitation, and modeling. Bandura's social learning theory, also called observational learning, focuses on the learning that occurs within a social context. So, observational learning occurs through observing the behavior of others. It is a form of social learning which takes various forms based on various processes. General principles of social learning theory. First, people can learn by observing the behavior of the others and the outcomes of those behaviors. So, for example, there are two siblings playing with their toys at home. When it's time to clean up, the younger sister walks away and lets the older brother to do the cleaning. Later, the sister sees her brother eating a cookie for cleaning up the mess they made. Next time they play, the sister helps her brother clean up and also gets a cookie. She repeats this behavior each time they play together, knowing she is likely to get a reward. So, from this scenario, a children or a people can learn by observing and outcomes of those behaviors. Second, learning can occur without a change in behavior. Behaviorists say that learning has to be represented by a permanent change in behavior. In contrast, social learning theorists say that because people can learn through observation alone, their learning may not necessarily be shown in their performance. Learning may or may not result in a behavior change. In other words, you can observe, imitate, or model something, but you might not learn it. Cognition plays a role in learning. Over the last 30 years, social learning theory has become increasingly cognitive in its interpretation of human learning. Awareness and expectations of future reinforcements or punishments can have a major effect on the behaviors that people exhibit. Cognitive skills promote long-term learning as it allows us to connect previous knowledge with new materials. It helps us merge old and new information and apply both effectively. Cognitive strategies promote a love of learning by making new knowledge exciting and fulfilling. Last principles. Social learning theory can be considered a bridge or a transition between behaviorist learning theories and cognitive learning theories. So, the social learning theory has often been called a bridge between behaviorist and cognitive learning theories because it encompasses attention, memory, and motivation. So, now we move on to how environment reinforces and punishes modeling. The observer is reinforced by the model. For example, a student who changes dress to fit in with a certain group of students has a strong likelihood of being accepted and thus reinforced by that group. The observer is reinforced by a third person. The observer might be modeling the actions of someone else. For example, an outstanding class leader or student. The teacher notices this and compliments and praises the observer for modeling such behavior, thus reinforcing that behavior. The imitated behavior itself leads to reinforcing consequences. Many behaviors that we learn from others produce satisfying or reinforcing results. For example, a student in my multimedia class could observe how the extra work a classmate does is fun. This student, in turn, would do the same extra work and also experience enjoyment. Consequences of a model's behavior affect the observer's behavior vicariously. So, this is known as vicarious reinforcement. For example, a student who hears the teacher praise a classmate for neat penmanship on an assignment and who then carefully handwrites his or her own assignment. So this is where the model is reinforced for a response, and then the observer shows an increase in that same response. Bandura also illustrated this by having students watch a film of a model hitting an inflated clown doll. One group of children saw the model being praised for such action. Without being reinforced, the group of children began to also hit the doll. Contemporary social learning perspective of reinforcement and punishment. First, contemporary theory proposes that both reinforcement and punishment have indirect effects on learning. People form expectations about the potential consequences of future responses based on how current responses are reinforced or punished. Reinforcement and punishment influence the extent of which an individual exhibits a behavior that has been learned. The expectation of reinforcement influences cognitive processes that promote learning. Therefore, attention plays a critical role in learning, and attention is influenced by the expectation of reinforcement. An example would be when the teacher tells a group of students that what they will study next is not on the test. Students will not pay attention because they do not expect to know the information for a test. So, cognitive factors in social learning. Learning without performance. Bandura makes a distinction between learning through observation and the actual imitation of what has been learned. Cognitive processing during learning. Social learning theorists contend that attention is a critical factor in learning. Expectations. As a result of being reinforced, people form expectations about the consequences that future behaviors are likely to bring. They expect certain behaviors to bring reinforcements and others to bring punishment. The learner needs to be aware, however, of the response reinforcements and response punishment. Reinforcement increases a response only when the learner is aware of that connection. Reciprocal causation. Bandura proposed that behavior can influence both the environment and the person. In fact, each of these three variables, the person, the behavior, and the environment, can have an influence on each other. Last, modeling. There are different types of models. There is the live model, an actual person demonstrating the behavior. There can also be a symbolic model, which can be a person or action portrayed in some other medium, such as television, videotape, computer programs. Behaviors that can be learned through modeling. Many behaviors can be learned at least partly through modeling. Examples that can be cited are students can watch parents read. Students can watch the demonstrations of mathematics problems or see someone act bravely in a fearful situation. Aggression can be learned through models. Research indicates that children become more aggressive when they observe aggressive or violent models. Moral thinking and moral behavior are influenced by observation and modeling. Moral judgment regarding right and wrong which can in part develop through modeling. This includes the conditions necessary for effective modeling to occur. First is attention. The person must first pay attention to the model. So if an observer is going to learn anything from a model, he or she must be paying attention to it and the behavior it exhibits. Many conditions can affect the observer's attention. For instance, if the observer is sleepy, ill, or distracted, he or she will be less likely to learn the modeled behavior and imitate it at a later date. Bandura and others have shown that humans pay more attention to models that are attractive, similar to them, or prestigious and are rewarded for their behaviors. Second is retention. The observer must be able to remember the behavior that has been observed. The second requirement of observational learning is being able to remember the behavior that was witnessed. If the observer does not remember the behavior, there is a less than probable chance that they will imitate it. Third is the motor reproduction, the ability to replicate the behavior that the model has just demonstrated. This means that the observer has to be able to replicate the action, which could be a problem with a learner who is not ready developmentally to replicate the action. For example, little children have difficulty doing complex physical motion. Last is motivation. Learners must want to demonstrate what they have learned. If the observer does not have a reason for imitating the behavior, then no amount of attention, retention, or reproduction will overcome the lack of motivation. Bandura identified several motivating factors for imitation. These include knowing that the model was previously reinforced for the behavior, being offered an incentive to perform, or observing the model receiving reinforcement for that behavior. Next is effects of modeling on behavior. First, modeling teaches new behaviors. Second, modeling influences the frequency of previously learned behaviors. Third is modeling may encourage previously forbidden behaviors. Modeling increases the frequency of similar behaviors. For example, a student might see a friend excel in basketball and he tries to excel in football because he is not tall enough for basketball. So these are the effects of modeling on behavior. Next is educational implications of social learning theory. Social learning theory has numerous implications for classroom use. First, students often learn a great deal simply by observing other people. Second, describing the consequences of behavior can effectively increase the appropriate behaviors and decrease inappropriate ones. This can involve discussing with learners about the rewards and consequences of various behaviors. Modeling provides an alternative to shaping for teaching new behaviors. Instead of using shaping, which is operant conditioning, modeling can provide a faster, more efficient means for teaching new behavior. To promote effective modeling, a teacher must make sure that the four essential conditions exist: the attention, retention, motor reproduction, and motivation. Teachers and parents must model appropriate behaviors and take care that they do not model inappropriate behaviors. Teachers should expose to dance to a variety of other models. This technique is especially important to break down traditional stereotypes. And that would be all our report. Thank you.